What if the story you've heard about the Trojan War wasn't the full truth? What if behind the myth there's a tale of betrayal, power struggles, and gods with their own hidden agendas? The ancient war that lasted 10 years, sparked by love, rage, and deception, is more than just a tale of heroes and villains. Let us unravel the secrets behind the Trojan War and discover the real story, one that's far darker and more complex than we've ever been told. The Trojan War didn't start with swords clashing or armies marching onto the battlefield. It all began with a seemingly innocent event, a beauty contest among three of the most powerful goddesses of Greek mythology. This wasn't your average contest, though. Stakes were high, and the consequences were disastrous. It all started when Eris, the goddess of strife and discord, was left out of a grand wedding feast held by Peleus and Thetis, two prominent figures in Greek mythology. Feeling insulted, Eris decided to crash the party in her own way. She threw a golden apple into the crowd, inscribed with the words for the fairest. The moment it landed, the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed the apple, believing it was meant for them. The dispute quickly escalated, and the three goddesses turned to Zeus for judgment. Zeus, ever the wise king of the gods, knew that making a decision between them would be impossible. So, he delegated the task to Paris, a Trojan prince, known for his fairness and sense of justice. The goddesses, desperate for the prize, each offered Paris a tempting bribe. Hera promised him power and wealth, Athena offered wisdom and military success, and Aphrodite promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen. Paris, swayed by the allure of Helen's beauty, awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, sealing his fate and setting the stage for the catastrophic war that would follow. But there was one problem. Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. This act of judgment by Paris ignited a chain of events that spiraled out of control. The gods themselves had begun to take sides, and the mortal world would soon be plunged into a war that would span a decade and shape the course of history. Paris, now in possession of Aphrodite's promised gift, Helen set off to claim his prize. But Helen's abduction wasn't as simple as it seemed. She wasn't kidnapped in the traditional sense. In some versions of the story, Helen fell in love with Paris of her own volition, bewitched by the goddess's magic. In others, it was Paris's charm that won her over. Either way, her departure from Sparta caused an outrage in Greece and set Menelaus on a path that would eventually lead to the Trojan War. But there was more to the story than just a beauty contest and an illicit affair. The gods weren't innocent bystanders in this conflict. They were actively manipulating events to their advantage. Each deity had their own interests at stake, using mortal pawns to achieve their goals. The Trojan War would not only test the strength of human warriors but also the power of the gods themselves. The flames of the Trojan War burned brighter as Menelaus, the betrayed king of Sparta, sought revenge for the loss of his wife, Helen. But this was indeed just a personal vendetta. It was a matter of honor for all of Greece.
Menelaus.
Menelaus wasn't alone in his quest. He had the backing of powerful allies, and together they formed a coalition that would change the fate of the ancient world. When Helen vanished with Paris, the shockwave was felt across Greece. Menelaus called upon the suitors who had once pledged their loyalty to him and sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage. Years earlier, these men had all competed for Helen's hand in marriage, and in doing so, they swore a solemn oath to defend the chosen husband of Helen from any harm or dishonor. Now Menelaus was calling on that oath. The most famous of these suitors was Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca. Though known for his wisdom and cunning, Odysseus initially hesitated to join the fight, not wanting to leave his home. However, his wife Penelope cleverly tricked him by pretending to have a son, Telemachus, and asked him to demonstrate his commitment to his oath. Odysseus, realizing he could not avoid the war, reluctantly agreed to lead the Greek forces. With Odysseus on board, Menelaus was able to assemble an army of some of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology, including Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, and king of Mycenae, Achilles, the nearly invincible warrior, and Ajax the Great, a towering figure in battle. Together, they formed a massive military force determined to sail to Troy and bring Helen back. But before they could launch their expedition, they had to face a difficult and ominous omen. The Greek fleet, ready to sail to Troy, found itself trapped by calm winds. They were stuck on the coast of Aulis, unable to move. This unexpected delay caused panic and frustration, and the Greeks turned to the oracle Calchas for guidance. The oracle revealed that the gods were displeased. The only way to gain their favor was to sacrifice Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Agamemnon, torn between his duty as a father and his commitment to the Greek cause, initially resisted. But, under the pressure of the situation and the demands of his fellow leaders, he reluctantly agreed to the sacrifice. This heart-wrenching decision marked the beginning of the Greek tragedy that would unfold on the shores of Troy. With the sacrifice made, the winds finally picked up, and the Greek fleet set sail for Troy. But even as they journeyed across the Aegean, they knew the stakes were high. The gods, especially Hera, Athena, and Poseidon, had already taken sides, with some supporting the Greeks and others backing the Trojans. This divine interference would become a constant thread throughout the war, with the gods actively guiding, manipulating, punishing mortals for their own purposes. As the Greek forces approached Troy, they were not just preparing for a military campaign, they were stepping into a world where fate, gods, and mortal ambition collided. What awaited them was a fortress that had withstood siege for years, and a city full of warriors, and rulers who were determined to defend it at all costs. The Trojan War was not just a battle for Helen, it was a battle for honor, pride, and the will of the gods. The Greeks arrived at the gates of Troy with the fury of 1,000 storms. The legendary city, protected by towering walls and legendary warriors, was not an easy target. The war, which began over a simple act of betrayal, would drag on for 10 years, with both sides suffering countless losses. It was a war that would become a tale of heroism, tragedy, divine interference, and the brutal reality of war. When the Greek forces landed at Troy, they were met with fierce resistance. The Trojans, led by their prince Hector, were determined to defend their city and their honor. Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, became the symbol of resistance against the invading Greeks. His bravery, skill, and sense of duty earned him the respect of both his allies and enemies. He fought tirelessly, defending the walls of Troy and holding off the Greek forces at every turn. But it wasn't just the warriors who shaped the course of the war. The gods played a significant role, each taking sides in the conflict and using their divine powers to influence the outcome of battles. While some gods favored the Greeks, others backed the Trojans, and this constant divine intervention only made the war more unpredictable. For the Greeks, the most notable divine supporter was Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy. She provided guidance to the Greek leaders, including Odysseus and Achilles, helping them with clever tactics and strategies. However, she also manipulated situations to her advantage, ensuring that the Greeks gained the upper hand when possible. On the Trojan side, Apollo, the god of the sun and prophecy, was a powerful ally. He lent his support to Hector and the Trojan army, often intervening to protect them from the Greeks. The god's constant meddling in mortal affairs made it clear that the war was not only a struggle between two human factions, but also a battleground for the gods themselves. One of the most famous events of the war was the duel between Hector and Achilles. Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, was unmatched in battle, and his reputation struck fear into the hearts of the Trojans. However, Achilles was not without his flaws. His rage, fueled by the death of his close friend, Patroclus, led him to kill Hector in a brutal and bloody encounter outside the walls of Troy. The death of Hector was a turning point in the war. It was not just the loss of a hero for the Trojans, but a symbol of their impending defeat. Hector's death was a devastating blow to the morale of the Trojan forces, and many began to lose hope. The gods, who had once favored the Trojans, now shifted their support to the Greeks, further sealing Troy's fate. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Trojans refused to give up. The war continued year after year, with both sides suffering immense casualties. The Greeks, desperate to break the deadlock, resorted to cunning tactics. One of the most famous tricks in military history was the Greek use of the Trojan Horse, a massive wooden structure that hid a group of Greek soldiers inside. The Greeks presented the Trojan horse as a gift, a symbol of their surrender. The Trojans, believing they had one, brought the horse inside the city walls as a token of peace. But that night, while the Trojans slept, the Greek soldiers emerged from the horse, opened the gates to the Greek army, and the city of Troy fell. The fall of Troy marked the tragic end of a war that had been fought for a decade. The Greeks, despite their loss of life, and the heavy cost of the war had succeeded in their mission. Helen was returned to Menelaus, but the destruction of Troy was complete. The gods, who had once interfered so greatly in the lives of mortals, watched as the city fell, their power still evident in the final moments of the conflict. The Trojan War wasn't just a story of war and heroism. It was a story of the cost of human ambition, the consequences of divine interference, and the complexities of fate. The city of Troy may have fallen, but the legacy of the war and its heroes would live on in the annals of history. The fall of Troy brought an end to a war that had consumed a decade of lives and shattered a great civilization. But as the Greek heroes returned home, they found that the victory came at a devastating price. The glory of their triumph was overshadowed by the grief of loss, the wrath of the gods, and the realization that the war, which had begun with such high hopes and ideals, had left behind a trail of destruction and regret. For the Greek leaders, the return home was fraught with challenges and tragedies. Menelaus, victorious in his quest to reclaim Helen, faced the daunting task of returning to Sparta with his wife. Despite her beauty and the love that had sparked the war, their relationship was never the same. Helen, who had once been the most desired woman in the world, was now a symbol of the pain and destruction the war had caused. The love that had ignited the flames of battle seemed distant and hollow in the aftermath. One of the most tragic figures of the Trojan War was Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces. Though he had led his army to victory, the cost was unimaginable. His sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia, had been necessary to gain the gods' favor, but it had haunted him. Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for the death of their daughter, was consumed by rage and betrayal. When Agamemnon returned to Mycenae, she murdered him in cold blood, symbolizing the bitter consequences of his actions and the curse that had befallen his house. The family's downfall was far from over, as his son, Orestes, would later avenge his death by killing Clytemnestra, perpetuating the cycle of violence and revenge. Meanwhile, Odysseus, the clever and resourceful king of Ithaca, faced a journey that would become one of the most famous tales in all of Greek mythology. His return home was delayed by a series of divine punishments and dangerous adventures, most notably involving the gods Poseidon and Athena. Odysseus's journey, filled with perilous encounters such as the Cyclops, the Sirens, and the land of the dead, would eventually become the subject of Homer's epic, the Odyssey. However, despite his wisdom and cunning, his journey home was long and fraught with suffering. His wife, Penelope, had waited faithfully for him, but the years of uncertainty strained their bond. Odysseus's return would signal the end of his personal struggle, but not without great cost. The story of the Trojan War's aftermath is not just about the physical toll of the conflict. It's also about the spiritual and emotional aftermath, the scars that remained long after the battlefields were silent. The gods, too, paid a price for their interference. While many of them had used mortals as pawns in their divine games, they were not without their own consequences. The war had been a battleground for the gods' egos, and in the end, many of them found their power diminished. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, could not undo the damage that had been done. The gods' involvement in mortal affairs was forever marked by the Trojan War. And it served as a reminder of how even divine beings could be brought low by their actions. Troy itself, of course, was no longer a shining city of wealth and glory. The city had been reduced to rubble, its people slain, enslaved, or scattered. The proud walls that had once withstood the greatest siege in history were now mere ruins. The legacy of the war lived on, but it was a legacy of sorrow, loss, and the endless cycle of vengeance that had plagued the survivors. Troy was no longer the glorious city it had once been. It had become a symbol of the fragility of civilization and the devastating consequences of human pride. The Trojan War, though a story of gods and heroes, also served as a timeless reminder of the destructive nature of war. It showed how easily the smallest spark could ignite a conflict that would consume generations. It demonstrated how those who seek glory often pay a price they can never fully understand. And it left behind a legacy that would be remembered not just by the Greeks and Trojans, but by the entire world for centuries to come. The aftermath of the Trojan War was not the end of the story. It was just another chapter in the never-ending cycle of human history, a story of ambition, love, revenge, and the consequences of our actions. And though the war may have ended, the questions it raised about the nature of power, justice, and fate continue to echo through the ages. Though the walls of Troy crumbled and the heroes of the Trojan War faded into myth, the story of the war endured, passing down through generations in the form of stories, poems, and lessons. The war, which began as a tale of love and betrayal, became a powerful symbol of the complexities of human nature, the costs of conflict, and the interplay between fate and free will. Its legacy is not just confined to ancient texts. One of the most enduring aspects of the Trojan War is the role of its heroes. Figures like Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Helen became larger-than-life symbols, embodying the best and worst of human nature. Achilles, with his near invincibility and overwhelming rage, his famous heel, the one weak spot on his body, reminds us that even the strongest among us have vulnerabilities. Hector, on the other hand, stands as a symbol of duty and sacrifice, a warrior who fought not for glory but for his city and his family. Hector's death marked the point at which the Trojan War lost its sense of honor and became a war of vengeance and despair. And then there is Odysseus, the clever king whose journey home after the war became one of the most famous tales of survival, resilience, and cleverness in history. Helen, the woman whose beauty sparked the war, too, became a figure of controversy and reflection. Was she a pawn in the gods' games, or was she an active participant in her own fate? The varying accounts of her role in the war show the complexity of human choice. Was she a victim of divine manipulation, or did she, in some versions of the story, fall in love with Paris willingly? The question of her agency remains one of the most debated aspects of the myth, and it's one that forces us to think about how our own actions and decisions can shape the world around us. In addition to the heroes, the Trojan War also left behind a legacy of wisdom and cautionary tales. The gods, though powerful, were not exempt from the consequences of their meddling. Their constant interference in mortal affairs proved that even those who wield ultimate power are not immune to the chaotic results of their actions. The war teaches us that when divine forces or rulers get too involved in the lives of individuals, it can lead to destruction rather than salvation. It's a reminder of the importance of respecting the autonomy of others and the dangers of unchecked authority. The war also carries important lessons about the nature of vengeance and the cycle of violence. After Hector's death, the Trojans and Greeks were caught in a never-ending loop of revenge and bloodshed. Achilles, filled with rage over the loss of his friend Patroclus, continued to fight mercilessly, ultimately killing Hector. But his vengeance, though seemingly justified, brought no peace to his heart. The Greeks, despite their victory, faced a future marked by tragedy, as Agamemnon's family descended into further violence and betrayal. And yet, despite the overwhelming destruction, the Trojan War also holds the potential for reflection and growth. The stories of the war were not simply told to entertain, but to teach future generations about the consequences of war, importance of leadership, and the significance of making the right choices. It has influenced countless works of literature, art, and philosophy, from Homer's epics to modern-day films, showing that the lessons of the Trojan War are still relevant today. The Trojan War also served as a turning point in the way humans understood fate and free will. The gods may have played a hand in shaping the events, but the heroes still had the power to make their own choices. Whether it was Achilles deciding to fight or Odysseus choosing to face the trials of the gods, the myth suggests that while fate may guide us, our actions and the choices we make define our destinies. Ultimately, the Trojan War is more than just an ancient conflict. It is a reflection of the timeless struggles humanity faces. It's about love and betrayal, pride and humility, and the relentless pursuit of glory. The war may have been fought long ago, but the story of Troy, of the men and women who lived and died within its walls, continues to resonate with us today. It reminds us that the cost of war is high, the consequences of our actions are far-reaching, and the stories we tell about the past have the power to shape the future. Why, as we look back at the Trojan War, we are reminded not only of the heroes who fought and the cities that fell, but also of the lessons that echo through the ages, that the nature of human conflict, the desires that drive us and the choices we make, are as relevant today as they were in the days of Troy.